You ever look around and wonder why it's so incredibly hard for us to solve our biggest problems? From climate change to the crazy political divisions, it just feels like we're stuck. Well, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating and, I gotta say, provocative analysis by author Michael Narberhaus. He asks why our civilization is struggling so much and suggests a totally different way of thinking that might be the key to getting us unstuck.
So just how serious is the situation we're in? Well, the author really doesn't pull any punches. He argues that we're not just dealing with a few separate problems, but a full-blown potential crisis for our entire civilization.
He starts us off with this really powerful metaphor. Think about it like this. Our entire civilization is a massive ship, and right now, that ship is sailing full steam ahead, directly towards a giant iceberg. And that iceberg? Well, that represents these huge existential threats like ecological collapse and the very real breakdown of our democratic systems.
And this isn't just some dramatic story. He backs this up with some pretty stark warnings from the scientific community. Top scientists are telling us, look, we are getting dangerously close to tipping points that could set off runaway climate change, a scenario they've literally dubbed hothouse Earth. So the point he's making is that this great transition he talks about, it isn't just a nice idea. It's framed as a matter of survival.
Okay, so if the danger is so obvious, what's stopping us from just turning the ship? The author argues that one of the biggest roadblocks and a major symptom of this whole crisis is the deep, growing chasm that's splitting our societies right down the middle.
To really help us get a handle on this divide, he uses this framework that basically splits society into two broad groups. On one side, you have the anywheres. They're often urban, well-educated, and pretty comfortable with globalization. And on the other side, you've got the somewheres, who are more rooted in a specific place and tend to value tradition and stability. This is such a useful way of looking at it because it helps explain these cultural fault lines that the old left versus right political map just doesn't capture anymore.
So what's fueling this big split? The author breaks it down into 5 key drivers. First, there's a feeling that our democratic institutions are just too distant and don't really represent people. Then you've got real economic fears, with working-class people seeing basically no benefit from globalization. There's also a sense of losing one's identity, a feeling that traditional values are under attack. Add in the rise of identity politics, and top it all off with social media, which acts like gasoline on the fire, amplifying the outrage on both sides.
And this is where we get to what's probably the most controversial part of the whole analysis. The author puts forward the idea that a specific strategy used by progressive activists, even with the best of intentions, might actually be making this dangerous polarization even worse.
He focuses on what he calls a dogmatic application of intersectionality. Now, just to be clear, intersectionality started as a really important framework for understanding how different parts of a person's identity, like race and gender, can overlap to create unique experiences of discrimination. But the author argues that a particular, rigid version of this idea has become the main lens for a lot of activism, one that he claims tends to view the world almost exclusively through the dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression.
And here's the real twist. According to the author, he uses this quote from Francis Fukuyama to argue that there's been this big unintended consequence. The argument is that by focusing so heavily on group identity, this approach has, ironically, pushed the somewheres to start using the exact same language of victimhood and to see themselves as the new oppressed group. And he doesn't just leave it there. He brings in psychological research to back this up. The argument from scholars like Stenner and Haidt is that when you constantly emphasize group differences, it doesn't actually lead to more tolerance. For about a third of the population, people who have what they call an authoritarian predisposition, basically a deep psychological need for order and conformity, it triggers the exact opposite reaction. It makes them retreat into intolerance.
And you can see the real-world fallout from this in the numbers. A huge majority of people feel like political correctness is actually shutting down conversations we need to be having. The author argues that this widespread feeling of being silenced creates the perfect opening, a vacuum, for populist leaders who come along and say, "I'll say the things no one else is allowed to say."
But, and this is really important, the author isn't just pointing fingers at one side. He zooms way out to argue that all this polarization is just a symptom of a much deeper issue, a kind of bug in our human software, a cognitive trap that every single one of us falls into.
The thing is, we are all hardwired for something called confirmation bias. It's our brain's natural tendency to look for information that confirms what we already believe and to ignore anything that challenges our worldview.
We all end up with a kind of tunnel vision.
This quote really just nails it. The more we rely on our ideological goggles, the more warped our picture of reality becomes. And this gets supercharged when we surround ourselves with people who think just like us. We create these echo chambers where our views don't get challenged, they just get more and more extreme.
He gives an example of how this plays out. In some progressive circles, he observes, really complex topics, like the role of hierarchy or competition in a society, get flattened out into these simple, good versus evil stories. They stop being open questions for debate and instead become these unquestioned dogmas, which actually stops us from finding better, more nuanced solutions.
So, if our strategies are backfiring and we're all stuck in our own little echo chambers, where do we go from here? Well, the author doesn't just diagnose the problem. He actually proposes a solution, and it requires a pretty fundamental shift in how we see ourselves and our world.
And here it is, the core proposal. We have to switch off the ideological autopilot. Instead of relying on these flawed, distorted maps of the world, he argues we need to get to know our own operating system. We need to look at ourselves through an evolutionary lens.
So what does that actually mean? Well, first, it's about being brutally honest with ourselves about our built-in tribal instincts, instead of just pretending they don't exist. It's about understanding the deep, intertwined history of how our genes and our cultures have shaped each other over millennia. And here's the most important part. It's about using that self-knowledge to consciously design social systems that work with our human nature, not against it, so we can become more adaptable and resilient in the face of these huge challenges.
And that leaves us with this powerful, final question. To steer that big civilizational ship away from the iceberg, do we first need to take a hard look inward and finally understand the ancient, evolved psychology of the crew? It's a challenging thought, suggesting that the key to solving our biggest external problems might just be found inside our own minds.